So the topic is broadly sort of misconceptions and gotchas in implementing Bluetooth LE, particularly for medical devices, and particularly Bluetooth LE, not so much Bluetooth Classic, which would be Bluetooth VR and EDR. I want to say that this is, the idea of misconceptions and gotcha sounds very much like, I know better than everyone else. And I'm not trying to suggest I know better than everyone else. What I'm trying to suggest is that I've seen a lot of designs come through. I've worked on a lot of designs, dozens of Bluetooth designs of varying types, in addition to non-Bluetooth designs, but also a lot of Bluetooth. And I have a particular perspective on that. And really, as I said before about questions and discussions, this is my opinions and based on my experience at Sunrise and working with people to design Bluetooth devices. But I'd love to hear from other people about their opinions and their, whether they agree with some of my assertions as well. So that's the general topic. So why are we talking about Bluetooth again? Bluetooth is ubiquitous. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. I think this list perhaps is backwards. The most important thing about Bluetooth is that everyone knows it. Everyone knows what Bluetooth is, what Bluetooth does. It's part of everything. Every connected device, our cell phones. Everyone has a smartphone these days. They all have Bluetooth connectivity. It's supported by enormous amounts of technology, whether they're modules or tools, hardware and software tools, things to measure your power consumption and to measure your link quality and to perform automated testing and modules to help you speed implementation, which is huge and makes it a very good option for a lot of connectivity requearments, for a subset of connectivity requirements. I'm not talking about Wi-Fi today. I could talk about Wi-Fi ad nauseum, or LTE or LoRa or any of the other protocols. They're not all competitors. They coexist to an extent. I think some of them compete in some spaces, but I think the particular perspective I'm trying to bring today is about Bluetooth and the space that it occupies. Just a quick note, about the idea of lots of modules being available. I think this is already getting. I haven't even gotten to my gotchas yet, but this is one that comes up fairly often. People tend to think, designers tend to think that using a pre-qualified Bluetooth module will get them out of a whole world of hurt when it comes to qualifying their design. And while that's not entirely wrong, it's also not entirely right. Pre-qualification when it comes to modules is sort of a two-pronged thing. There's the FCC certification of the module, and there's the Bluetooth pre-qualification or Bluetooth qualification of the module as a Bluetooth module. And both are useful and important, but neither is actually final. I think there's a thought out there by designers that if they use a Bluetooth module, they don't have to worry about the FCC and they don't have to worry about the Bluetooth special interest group. And that's not true on either front. You are still required to qualify your device with Bluetooth. You may just be able to use a whole host of evidence from the module to support that qualification. It still requires paying them the whatever $8,000 fee or whatever it is these days to get access to using their logo and to have it actually be called a Bluetooth qualified device. On the FCC side, the FCC will certify modules, but it does not certify the system. The system still has to be certified separately. You may be able to sneak around certifying as an intentional emitter if the Bluetooth module is the only intentional emitter in your design, in your system. But that doesn't mean you get out of the requirements for system testing, which the FCC requires, which are largely the same as what 60601-1-2 require. So if you're doing a medical device, you're doing that testing anyway, predominantly. So I'm already getting into gotchas. I haven't even gotten there yet. So, in terms of the topic at hand here, I think part of the message is that everyone wants Bluetooth in their devices. We are seeing this from every angle. Every one of our customers, our clients, comes to us and wants Bluetooth in the device, whether we're talking about a piece of laboratory equipment or a wearable device. And I think it's great. I like this this reference to Jurassic Park because I find it funny. I think it is perhaps not exactly my thought on the point. I'm not trying to imply that people shouldn't, put Bluetooth in their devices. But I think people think so much, or they don't think so much about it. They just think, yeah, we can do that. We can add Bluetooth to it. And they don't think about what it means to do so. And I think it's important to remember that a one-star rating on Amazon or in the Apple App Store is much worse than no rating at all. And by adding a function to your system, whether it's Bluetooth or another function, but Bluetooth is a very easy target that doesn't perform well, you can actually harm the effectiveness or the sellability of your product, even if it's not particularly directly related to the function of your device. You may think you're tacking it on as just an added feature that users get to use if they want to, but that's not how reviewers are going to see it. They're going to see it as an integral feature to the product, even if it's not, and they're going to ding your product on that. That was a lesson that I'm not sure that Fluke and Agilent learned at the time, but they started adding Bluetooth connectivity to multimeters. And if you look at the reviews of those multimeters, the multimeters are great multimeters, but they get terrible reviews because the Bluetooth connectivity was terrible. And I think people should keep that in mind, when they're designing the devices, that if you don't design it with intent, then it's not going to turn out well. That being said, as I mentioned, I don't want to discourage people from adding Bluetooth to their devices. I think people should. I think this is part of the future. I think whether you're talking about personal area network devices, watches and phones and medical monitors and things like that, therapeutics, weight scales, you name it. I think connecting them is great. And I think the pervasiveness of Bluetooth is fantastic, and I think should only increase and will only increase over time. But I think that rather than seeing it as a checkbox, a box to check, you should really look at it as something, as a feature that you were intentionally designing in and design around it. And to that point, I think one of the major areas that people need to consider more and work on more when they implement Bluetooth is really about usability and user workflows. The expectation from customers is that Bluetooth is seamless. This is one of the reasons that Bluetooth took a while to take off, actually. Bluetooth has been around for decades. But in its original implementations, it was not seamless. It was annoying. You had to do things like repair your devices frequently, or re-authenticate your devices frequently, or reconnect your devices, intentionally go and reconnect your devices. And from a device designer standpoint, this often seems like a very small issue. It's so what? So a person has to spend a couple seconds going and clicking a button. But from a user standpoint, it's terrible. Users have absolutely no patience for this overhead for this sort of application. This is perhaps an interesting disparity between considering implementing Bluetooth versus implementing Wi-Fi. The workflows and the expectations from the users are very different, even if a lot of times the payloads may be the same. The data you're trying to communicate is the same. The way a user expects to interact with Wi-Fi is very different. They expect to be contained within the locality of their access point network, and to have to intentionally connect to their network, and to be part of that network and everything that entails, like a computer, like a laptop. Whereas with Bluetooth, they don't expect that. The Bluetooth has really pitched itself as, and has been taken to be a replacement for wires. That was its original intent, and how people sort of view it. And you never have to re-authenticate your USB connection. It's not a thing you have to do. You never have to, well, you rarely have to worry about replugging it in. And if you do, it's because you've got a faulty cable or something, you replace the cable and you curse at the other cable and probably don't throw it away for some reason, and it comes and bites you later. But people get really annoyed by those sorts of interruptions. They don't want to be interrupted. They want it to be seamless. They want to just work. They want to just work so much that's even the name of one of the Bluetooth pairing modes, is the Just Works pairing mode. And it's one of the most popular. I don't know if it's actually the most popular. I don't have statistics on that. Certainly within the devices we've designed, it is among the most popular. It's probably as popular as the other two modes combined. And that's because of usability. It's because people want the devices to just work. And so that, I mean, that needs to be considered when you're designing the device. You have to think about, you know, these user workflows and how they're going to pair with the device, what it means for them to pair with the device, how they're going to access information from the device, how long it's going to take them to access information from the device. You know, is your device always advertising, or does it keep a persistent connection? You know, what are the implications to that on the responsiveness of the device and of the information presented to the user? Does the device itself have a user interface, a graphical user interface of some kind, or is it relying entirely on a cell phone to present information? I would say more and more we're seeing these devices that are headless. They have no way of presenting information to the user. They rely entirely on the user's smartphone to do so. And that has a lot of implications for how you interact with the device. You know, you can't do things like code matching. You can't do things like input a passcode onto your device because you don't have that user input. And how you manage that makes a big difference. You can manage it by having it not care about security, but that's a huge no-no in today's world. You can play tricks. We've played tricks with you know, 2D barcodes on devices to identify them, or other sorts of out-of-band pairing methods, and those are of varying degrees of effectiveness, but they all add something to the user workflow of pairing, and not just of pairing, but potentially of other features. Like I mentioned, the distinction between advertising and connecting. Do you persist a connection, or you drop out to advertisement? If your device is one that has to talk with multiple different people, you may not want to persist a connection. But if you specifically don't want to talk to multiple people, if you're a patient-centric device, you may want to persist a connection. There's also power implications of persisting a connection versus not. These are all, you know, minutia, and they sound like minutia, and they sound like things you shouldn't have to worry about. But if you don't worry about them, then you're very easily going to create a situation where the user has to spend a few extra seconds doing something. And if they have to spend a few extra seconds every time they want to check their medication or check whether their device worked as expected, or if it captured what they wanted to capture, then they either won't use it, or they'll use it begrudgingly and give you a bad review, and that may impact your product's success. Additionally, there's tons of different communication modes. You don't actually have to have a connection at all. Bluetooth devices can talk to each other without ever entering into a connected state. It's becoming more and more popular with beacons to identify things. That may be more and more popular in the future, as the next version of the Bluetooth standard will include the Bluetooth LE audio functionality, which has a broadcast mode where people walking by can just listen to whatever's being broadcast from your Bluetooth device. I don't know how much impact that will have on medical devices. I'm sure hearing aids will be big, or this feature in hearing aids will be big. The idea is to have every TV be broadcasting its audio stream, so that people who are hearing impaired at an airport, for example, can just hear what the TV is saying without you know, having to turn up their hearing aid and get all of the ambient noise from all the people talking around them. So I expect there will be some implications of that, but that's a bit in the future. That hasn't actually come out yet. So in ways to annoy the user here is, you know, if taking a lot of time, and a lot of time being defined as any sort of humanly perceptible amount of time. If a person can perceive the amount of time it takes them to get what they want, they will be annoyed by it. People want instant gratification. And for Bluetooth low energy, that can be a real problem, because sometimes you do have connection latencies on the order of large fractions of a second to potentially even multiple seconds. We've had devices which had to run off of very tiny coin cells, smaller than your standard CR2032, much smaller, you know, a quarter of the size or less, and run for potentially years. And so one of the ways you do that is by making it very unresponsive, basically. If it responds very slowly, then you can save all that power that was been used to talk to no one. But that has huge implications to the usability of the device that have to be designed into the overall solution, the overall system. In addition to that, or perhaps in lieu of that, one of the ways we sort of address that is communicating state to the user. This is something I see a lot, all the time, pretty much, is poor communication of the sort of device state and the link state to the user. They don't necessarily need to or want to know all of the nitty-gritty details about, you know, the handshake parameters and the connection parameters and things like that. But so many devices will have a button that says connect. I mean, we worked on a very particular device, I can't say what the device was, but it was a handheld, button cell operated, 18-month lifetime medical device that was always advertising, and had no screen on it or anything. So there was no way of it telling you what the state was, what state it was in, whether it was connected, whether it was just advertising. And the app, we didn't design the app. The app was a third-party app, and it had a connect button. And you'd press the connect button, and it would just sit there until it connected. It would show no indication that it had done anything when you pressed connect. And with a device like this that has to conserve power so much, the advertising rate is so slow that it could take 6 seconds to connect to it. And that's 6 seconds to a designer sounds like, it's only 6 seconds that we're wasting on the users. But to the user, that feels like an eternity of not knowing what their device is doing or what their phone is doing and whether it's even connecting. And that can be mitigated very easily in the app design side by giving some indication that it's doing something, even if you don't have good information, just a progress bar so that the user doesn't know it's hung up. You may not even have real progress, just a timer could be useful. Say that you're scanning for the next 3 seconds or 6 seconds, and give them some indication of how long it might take them. Say, be patient, this can take 6 seconds or 10 seconds. It's not directly related to the protocol, but it's a very important aspect of designing Bluetooth devices that I think I know is often overlooked. I've seen it overlooked in many, many designs. And something that's, one last thing to mention here is something that's plagued Bluetooth devices for a long time is repairing and re-authentication type problems. This is more of a problem with Bluetooth Classic profiles rather than Bluetooth Low Energy, but it still happens, and it's a way to quickly annoy your users. A lot of Bluetooth devices, people don't want to even recognize that there is a link to deal with. They want it to be seamless. You think of an Android Auto application. You get into your car. You want your phone to connect to your car. You don't want to have to go in and type a passcode every time. And when it loses your credentials and you're in the middle of driving and you say, I need to get directions or something, and it says no phones connected, you say, now I have to find a place to turn off the highway and stop and re-authenticate my phone, and it's it's a huge impediment to using a device. People don't want to use a device that makes them do that. That was a lot to say on one slide. I should probably speed it up here. So workflow design. So I talked a bit about there being workflows, just pairing and things like that. There's a lot of workflows. There's more than you think. It's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking that Bluetooth is a very simple, easy, just a wire replacement. It just works, but it doesn't. There's so many corner cases. There's so many actual normal use cases. What is your device doing when it's not in use? That's from a device that isn't connected. That's not such a big deal necessarily. If it's not being used and it doesn't do anything in the background, it just doesn't do anything. But with a Bluetooth device, it might need to advertise. How fast does it advertise? How quickly does it need to respond to requests from a scanner? These are important things to take into account. What sort of scanners can it connect to? Does it only connect to one person? Is it whitelisted, or does it connect to many potential other peer devices? There's lots more workflows than people think when they first start developing a Bluetooth device. And when I say people, not everyone. Some people know this, but I very frequently see this with people who design Bluetooth devices. They think about the happy path. They think about the intended use case. When it's connected, it's talking, everything's working fine, and they don't really think about even some of the sort of obvious corner cases. Firmware update is a big one too. There's a lot of risks in firmware updates. Everyone expects it now. We've had, I think, one device where the hazard analysis sort of led us towards, or the risk management process led us towards not including over-the-air updates on the device, and even that will likely get overturned at some point. The problem is there's too many scares about cybersecurity, things like that, particularly in the wake of the Sven-tooth vulnerabilities that were released earlier this year. I think it was, maybe it was last year. But the idea is that stacks are vulnerable, stacks are flawed, and your code is vulnerable and flawed. And so there is a good reason to want to update it over time. But now you have to have a user able to to do that. And that is not a straightforward thing to build, not a straightforward workflow to build into your product and your app. Users are predominantly not savvy to these sorts of things. Asking them to open up, the off-the-shelf Nordic tools, the NRF Connect, I think it's called, for performing a firmware update is asking a lot of most users. And it's a slow process, and it's a process that's risky. It's a process that, if interrupted, can potentially break your device. So there's a lot to consider in just that one workflow that is usually sort of completely ignored in the early formation of a device. People say, well, that's just a thing that, again, is a box that we need to check. And people don't necessarily think about how difficult it is to actually make that work in a seamless manner. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is ones that I just thought of off the top of my head, basically. And there's combinations of them. There's times when you might be collecting data and you need to update the firmware at the same time. That is an actual use case that can come. You might need to collect data in charge. You might need to be idle in charging. There's all kinds of combinations of workflows. You can usually lump them, into different types of interactions and types of states. And that can help sort of pare it down to approachable problems. Not every device needs 100 pages worth of definition around its user workflows. However, I will say that I've seen at least one device that didn't have that many user interactions and still had 100 pages of definition around the user workflows. It can really grow extensively and really should in a lot of cases, because if you don't think about them, someone's going to run into it and they're going to give you a bad review. I guess I kind of hate that. That's my overarching theme is you don't want bad reviews, but it is a really important one. We're in a world today where everything is reviewed. Everything gets a star rating, and it makes a huge difference. We've been asked to provide examples of this, how many stars our devices and apps have gotten before. It's a big deal. So next topic. That's all I'm going to say about workflows for now. I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit. The second sort of topic, maybe it's third at this point, I don't know, protocol design. And there's lots of different aspects to protocol design, some that are more, more gotchas than others. I would sort of focus on these as ones that I see all the time, pretty much all the time. And the first one up there is one that I think I've seen in, I shouldn't say almost every application we've picked up, whether it's from a customer of ours who had some previous work done, or if it's an off-the-shelf part. Everyone wants to implement a serial port profile in Bluetooth LE. And it's doable. It's actually very easy to do, but it is almost never the right solution. It seems to be everyone's go-to, probably because that was the easiest profile to integrate with Bluetooth Classic. But it's not a profile that exists in Bluetooth LE. Even though everyone does it, the Bluetooth SIG has never actually formalized that with a profile definition around that. And there's a reason for it, because it's not really how the protocol is intended to be used. And there's good reason for that. It's a very inefficient way to use the protocol. The Bluetooth protocol, Bluetooth LE in particular, requires this whole structure of attribute tables, the GATT profile, that provides a ton of functionality, that provides a ton of metadata and a ton of contextual information about what you're trying to communicate. And so many people just bypass all of that and put a serial port on there, or a serial port emulator, and then build another protocol, a custom protocol on top of that to communicate their information back and forth. There are reasons to do that. There are sometimes reasons to do that. The best reason I've seen to do that is when trying to implement a shell interface of some kind, a terminal interface on the device, whether that's a REPL or a custom shell of some kind, and that's an inherently serial protocol type interaction. So yeah, there's reasons you might want to do that. Even in those cases, I think it's usually smart to leverage the additional functionality that the Bluetooth protocol provides you, and have other characteristics that can help you do things like reset your serial port, or side channels for data access, which is a big one when you're doing things asynchronously. There's often good reasons to not limit yourself to a serial port profile. But I would, it's not every, but it's almost every device we see, does this. Another reason I've heard for doing this is one that it's not really great in my opinion, is obfuscation. I see a lot of people trying to obfuscate for security. They want others to not know what data they're sending, and so they try to use as few of the protocol functions, the Bluetooth protocol functions that give you such a rich language for communicating or for describing what you're communicating, in an attempt to prevent people from knowing what they're communicating, and that's frustrating. People have known or considered obfuscation a poor method of security since the 19th century. I think there was a famous story about that in mid-19th century. This is not a new idea that obfuscation is not really security. And so it's not super useful. And what it does do is it makes development take a lot longer, and it's a lot more painful, because now you're adding this new protocol layer that you have to then control and manage, and you're losing all the expressiveness of the Bluetooth language. That ties in with the second point. There are tons of standard profiles. The Bluetooth SIG has been adding more and more every year. There's dozens of them out there for various things, including a lot that overlap with healthcare, heart rate sensors, blood pressure monitors, things like that. There's standard profiles for communicating that information. I've heard some people avoid using them to specifically because they don't want generic apps or third-party apps to work with their device. I can see the reason for that. I can see the reason for it, and when that is a requirement, we have gone that way. But it's a foolish requirement in my opinion. We've seen this time and time again, that trying to control all of that, information flow and information access, again, just annoys users. It doesn't really make them want to use your product. They may have their Apple Health app and they want to use their Apple Health app. They don't want to use your third-party app that is your third-party app, which they view as a third-party app, to interact with their data separately from everyone else's devices. Also, while it's not yet, as far as I know, unless I'm doing it wrong, it's not yet an FDA requirement. It's pushing in that direction. So what was it called? The Continua Health Alliance, I think it was called at one point. They've gone through a few different names and organizations at that point, but basically tried to address this, I don't know, a decade ago or 7 years ago, by pointing out that ISO 11073, I think it is, doesn't cover BLE. In fact, it's impossible to make a 11073 compliant BLE link. You can make it compliant through the application layer, but not through the device layer, or not through the communications layer. And so the guidance was to follow and use the standard profiles whenever there is one available. The FDA, I've heard, likes this idea. I haven't heard anyone required to follow it yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes a requirement in the future. And then, along the same lines as before, rather than having one serial port profile where where all of your data has to now be packaged by you into another protocol that's then serialized over the link, don't do it. Break down your functionality into simpler blocks. There's a concept of data types within the Bluetooth attribute structure. Attributes are lightweight. They're not super lightweight, but they're relatively lightweight. They're lightweight enough that increasing the size of your attribute table is not going to break the bank from a memory standpoint or a power standpoint. We've run the numbers on this many times, because people will come and say, "Oh, we need to extract a byte out of our discovery process because we don't want to waste the energy transmitting the extra byte." And if you're talking about a very fast advertising rate, a very fast connection rate, and sucking a byte out of every one of those packets, that's one thing. But if you're talking about an attribute table, attributes are the structure of information in the language, and once you read that structure, once the other side of the link, the phone in this case, reads that structure, it never really needs to again. So it's a one-time cost savings, power cost savings. and it doesn't really save you anything. So use them, use attributes. There are descriptors on attributes within the generic attribute profile of Bluetooth that can tell the other device, the device at the other end, what kind of information is being sent over with some level of specificity. It's not perfect. You can't give it infinite, control over the type of data that's being sent, or understanding the type of data that's being sent. But it can be very helpful, both in the use of your device, the general use of your device, and also in the development of your device. I will say that expressive protocols or expressive profiles are much easier to develop for, and much easier to extend in the future. If you want to add functionality to your device, using a wide and expressive profile is much easier to work with than one that tries to implement its own serialization protocol on top of Bluetooth. That's all I really want to say about that, I think. So lastly, cybersecurity stuff, everyone's favorite topic. It comes up a lot. Bluetooth has historically been seen as very vulnerable. It still is. I think people have sort of forgotten until a couple of reminders in the last year with a couple of big vulnerability publications. But Bluetooth is a very vulnerable protocol in general. The first point there is one that that one's not so much a gotcha, but it's something that it's a point that I think I've come to realize over time. I didn't immediately get this when for the first time, a couple dozen implementations I've done. But it comes up a lot when you look at trying to address the cybersecurity risks of your device. You really figure out that that Bluetooth security always relies on proximity, and so there's always this push to make it more and more secure. But you end up running into the problem that there's diminishing returns, because once you get to a certain proximity to the person whom you're trying to attack, then it no longer really matters whether you have access to their Bluetooth device, because you have very personal access to them. So it's kind of important to remember that this is all about extent, and the extent is in proximity. And if you don't get that immediately, don't worry. It took me a while to figure it out, but let me just sort of go through what I mean by that. So there are sort of three levels of pairing built into the Bluetooth protocol. And there's more than three ways of breaching the security of a Bluetooth device. But the three levels of pairing are just works, a passkey, or out-of-band pairing. And just works pairing basically will pair to anyone who's in the area with very little knowledge about who that person is. Anyone who asks to exchange information, it'll exchange information with. And that can still be a secure connection. You can still encrypt that connection, and once you're in that connection, it's not trivial to break it. It's not the best encryption, 128-bit AES, but it's good enough encryption that someone who's within the link area and just sniffing your packets is not likely to be able to break it in real time. Someone could potentially analyze the data after the fact and maybe break it, but it'll be limited to whatever they captured while you were within proximity to them again. But basically, the protection proximity, the protection perimeter of JustWorks pairing is within the range of Bluetooth, because anyone who's within your range can pair to you, and that's so you're not really protected against them. Anyone outside of your range, you're fairly safe from, because if they come in while you're paired, they'll see the encrypted traffic. They won't understand how to decrypt that. Passkey encryption brings that proximity in closer to sort of visible range of the passkey, whether that's a passkey that's on a screen or it's physically printed on a device or a piece of paper. Anyone who's within visible range of that passkey knows how to pair to that device and can do so. So your device is no longer secure to them within that range. That range tends to be shorter than smaller than the range of your Bluetooth connectivity or your Bluetooth network. And out-of-band pairing is most commonly implemented with NFC. There are other ways of doing it. Like I said, 2D barcodes is a way, but usually it's something that's very, very close in proximity. NFC only works at a very close range, often millimeters. And so someone has to have basically physical access to your device in order to get that key and be able to pair it to your device. So it's still at risk to someone who has physical access to your device, but it's at less risk than the visible passkey or than the just works pairing. There's a sort of fourth level, which is not one of the pairing modes, but a fourth level of risk is physical access. So that was one of the vulnerabilities that was released earlier in this year, was people figured out how to do voltage fault injection on, I think it was Nordic parts, but you can do voltage fault injection on basically any part and get by whatever security is on it. It's been shown to work on some of the tightest security chips on the market. If you're very, very clever and you know enough about what's going on, you can usually do that. But it requires physical access to the chips and being able to inject voltages. There are ways you can potentially protect against that by encapsulating the thing, but then more access is just depotting it, which someone can do with enough time. My point is that this all is sort of proximity based, right? You can keep whittling down the area of concern, but it's just a reduction in that concern. It needs to be considered that way. There's no way of making it perfectly secure. And that leads to the next point, which is use a risk-based approach. Recognizing that this is the case, you can sort of say, well, how close should someone need to be for it to be a concern for us, right? Where do I want to make this radius of protection? And that can inform what you build into the system. Oftentimes we find that just works pairing is enough because the expectations of use are such that you aren't expected to be around a malicious party who's close enough to have consistent enough access to your Bluetooth link, but doesn't have better ways of harming you, is one of the main considerations. The other consideration there is, with a risk-based approach, there's ways you can usually design a device and the protocol to limit the actual information, the sensitive information that is available to someone who is a malicious party, whether that's just information and snooping or is actual control. In an ideal situation, if there's no way to control your device over Bluetooth and it doesn't send any information, then there's nothing to protect. Obviously, that's not going to be a very useful device, but that's sort of one extreme. The other extreme is if your device knows everything about you and it can control whether you live or die, then obviously the risk profile is very, very different. And so the goal is to try and move it as far to the easy end of that spectrum rather than the hard end of that spectrum. And it's usually easier than it sounds. It's rarely the case that your Bluetooth peripheral, which is usually the medical device, needs to have information that's identifiable information about the patient. Right? Usually that can be stored on the person's phone. They can enter it themselves in the phone. That's not really part of your system, so you have less control over the security of it, and you rely on the person's judgment to control that information. And it eliminates the transmission of that information over the link, thereby eliminating the chance that someone's going to be able to snoop that information. So there's ways you can limit the risk profile without trying to add more encryption on encryption on encryption, which is another approach, but is ultimately always going to be limited. And then the last point about cybersecurity is one I think I wrote a blog post kind of to this point. It's something that I've seen an awful lot. This is a gotcha, or a set of gotchas, is that link parameters, things like permissions, and state information, things like the subscriptions to notifications, I wrote in there, is often left to the user or the application developer to manage. And that is very risky. You look at the Sventooth vulnerabilities, and they were basically really stupid attacks on the bounds checking was one of the main ones on commands sent over the link that targeted commands that were interpreted by the stack. They didn't target anything that was handled by the application, but the important thing to remember there is that the stack has a lot more eyes on it, which means it's actually more secure. It's less likely to have errors with bounds checking and things like that, because there's a lot more investment that goes into developing that stack usually than in any individual application. And so many applications that I've seen the code for and or interacted with have had a complete failure of things like bounds checking. And I have a quick example it's not an example of an actual device or anything. I don't even need to go to a device. I can go straight to the code that you download from, in this case, TI, but I don't want to single out TI. You find this in every implementation, basically, for writing an attribute. I believe this is this is the attribute, I should include the function name at the top here. But this is extremely fragile code. You can see what they're doing is they're checking what you want to write. And if it's one of these couple of things, it falls through to this code, which does some checking of whether or not things are within bounds. And then it chooses to write to it. And the problem is, if you then try to extend this profile, you may not catch that there's a fall through here in the switch statement, or that there's the bounds checking is done completely separately from the writing itself. In which case, you may add characteristics that are not protected. And when I say you may, I think I've seen that in maybe not every case. Again, that would be a huge hyperbole if I said every case, but in lots and lots of cases, this happens all the time. I think if you were to, sorry, I don't know if you can hear it. There's someone crying in the background.
That's how we all feel with this topic.
Yeah, right. If you were to sort of probe lots of products that are out there on the market, I haven't done it personally, but I have a hunch based on how many I have done that weren't marketed products. You would find that very few of them implement things like balance checking or notifications and permissions well. They're getting better. A lot of these stack implementations are getting better and will handle a lot more of it for you in basic cases. But even then, it's usually for basic cases. If you try to do something outside of the norm, which is very common, then you're often left to yourself to implement a lot of these functions. And that's just prone to error. I mean, like I said, this is fragile code. This is code that I would, if I was the reviewer, if I was the peer reviewer of this code, I would have a lot of problems with the way it's written. It's very likely to break with any changes in the future. Maybe not the most fragile code in the world. They actually use brackets, but that's something, but it's a minor something. And one other point about fragile code in the stacks, and again, I don't mean to pick on TI or any of them. They all do this, and it's kind of intrinsic to how these things are designed. There's tons of indirection and tons of abstraction, and so you'll get, to get to this function that writes a characteristic, which isn't even usually the end function that writes a characteristic. I think in this particular case, there's 4 layers of callbacks to get to this point, 4 layers of indirection. Where the data is shunted from one part of the code in one file to another part of the code in usually another file. And so tracing the data through here is very difficult, and there's lots of opportunities for doing the wrong thing with it, for taking that data and just writing it straight to memory, or ignoring the bounds and writing it to a different address in memory, or a different offset in memory. Or, as actually I think I've seen more often because I've tested it more often, reading something beyond the bounds of the thing you're intending to read. The blob functionality, the blob read, which it mentions here, the blob hopper, allows you to set an offset to read from. If there's no bounds checking on that, you can read memory that's not within the bounds of the Bluetooth table, which could be someone's identifiable information, could be something that you don't want people to read. And that's an extremely common issue. So anyway, I'm going to sort of end it here. Key takeaways. I think workflow design is a lot harder than you think. It's harder than I think. I mean, I'm always surprised by how much work it takes to design the process by which the user interacts with your device. Don't fight the GAT. There's so many tools for making expressive profiles out there. They're easier to design. They're easier to maintain. They don't really harm your security at all. Just use them. But they don't harm your security, but Bluetooth LE is an easy target for hackers. I'm amazed there haven't been more significant hacks. But a lot of that risk is within your control through either data management in general. Don't send information that you don't need to send, or through through good coding practices and things like bounds checking, which are very important to preventing people from getting access to data they shouldn't have. And that's it. That's all I'm going to say. But I'd love to hear from all of you and engage in discussions on this.
Well, we definitely have some questions, which is great. Nick,
Oh,
that
good.
was awesome. That was so much information. And at what point I just had to laugh. I was like, so nothing is safe. I understand what you're saying, but it's okay. You made it sound very positive. Like you could do something about it, but nothing is safe.
Yeah, I
So
don't want to give the impression that nothing is safe. I think it's a lot more, it's a lot easier of a target than people think, but also it's not that easy of a target. You know, I say it's proximity based, but the largest sort of proximity region is within the connection range. And most Bluetooth devices are things that move around. And
mm.
so that range changes. And so having one bad actor have enough access to your device to break it is very difficult usually.
So that leads into some of the questions that I actually do have and got in from the audience. So, one that plays right into that is how often do you think attacks actually do happen in a clinical environment? How prepared should people be for that?
I think they're extremely rare. I think we would hear about them when they happen. I think we've heard about, there was one years ago. Um, I think they're extremely rare in practice. And I think that speaks to two things. One, I think it speaks to, like I said, even though the connection, Bluetooth is not the most secure of protocols, there is this inherent proximity security. And just to expand on that just a little bit, this is true of, I think this is my opinion, that's true of security in general. And one of the reasons why you see less attacks on Bluetooth than on internet-based protocols, Wi-Fi, Ethernet, is that those basically extend the proximity perimeter to the entire world. If once you connect to the Wi-Fi network, you're on an IP network. Anyone in the world can basically try to talk to you. There's limits to that, but in general, that's sort of the proximity of your access there.
Okay, so another question that came in. What are some tips for supporting multiple platforms?
What do you mean by multiple platforms? Like
So
Android and
iOS,
iOS?
Android, Windows.
So use Bluetooth LE. Yeah, I didn't go into the history of it, and I'm not even sure my memory of the history of it is accurate. But my memory of the history of Bluetooth LE is that it exists, or rather, it has gained so much popularity and so much of the market share of Bluetooth in general over Bluetooth Classic, not because of the technical benefits of it, which are slight, but because of the interoperability of it. Because Apple required you to jump through hoops to talk Bluetooth Classic to iPhones and iPods back when iPods were a thing, and didn't require that Bluetooth LE because of the way it's structured. The device control, the link control, is a little bit cleaner and less prone to application specific sort of problems. So there's less tuning involved for different platforms. On the device side, the application side, good luck. There's tools that we use. We develop apps in Xamarin a lot, which is a cross-platform tool that is a fairly good cross-platform tool. There's a lot of cross-platform tools out there, but Xamarin is fairly good and has good support for a lot of the underlying system functionality like Bluetooth.
Okay, so what Bluetooth vulnerability disclosure sources can you recommend from a CBOM monitoring point of view?
Oh my gosh, I don't even, I can't. I can't recommend one. I only know of a couple of disclosures, and they were on different from different sources. So I can't recommend them. Yeah.
Okay, that's an easy answer.
Yeah.
So let's see. I had a couple more coming in. What's the difference between pairing and connecting? Is there a difference?
Sure. One instigates security and one does not. Anything can connect to anything, basically. That's with the exception of whitelisting, the concept of whitelisting. That's generally true that any Bluetooth device can connect to any other Bluetooth device, but you can't always get access to what's on it. And so there's levels of access, which is a good tip, by the way. If you really are worried about people inspecting the type of device you are by looking at the attribute table when they first connect, and connection process always is connect and then discover the attributes, discover the services and the characteristics. And if you don't want people to get information about what type of device you are from that point before they pair, there's a mechanism for doing that. You can hide all of your services that you don't want people to see until after they've paired, or any time after they've authenticated that they are who they say they are. Then you can use the service change notification, it's called, to tell the other side that, oh, by the way, I've got all these functions that I didn't tell you about before because you didn't tell me that it was safe to tell you.
Okay, so there are some questions in the chat, and I'm gonna try to give them to you, but I'm gonna be real.
I don't see the chat.
I don't actually understand the question because this is not my area. So, but I'm assuming you may understand more than I do. So on protocol design, thoughts on characteristics with opcodes and reads from the client phone done as a write and notify.
That is, I didn't quite understand the question. The question is,
me neither. Bethany, if you are still on the line and want to take yourself off mute and ask your question, that may be the easiest thing to do, because I don't understand the question, but that's just
sure. I'll give it a try. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, just instead of, like you had mentioned, you know, breaking functionality into simpler blocks and having lots of attributes is fine and things like that. Sort of thinking on that in that vein, like having a profile with a bunch of, let's say, you know, small characteristics versus having one characteristic that has that you can basically access information from, like a control point type of a thing, like, and use opcodes. Does that help?
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. No, that would fall into adding more complexity.
One versus the other.
Sorry, what was that?
Just thoughts on one versus the other.
Yeah, so the idea of using a single characteristic to instigate multiple responses, multiple different context-related responses, you know, where that context might be what you write to that characteristic. It's very old school. You know, I remember doing that very specifically with, I think it was a CC2540, one of the earlier chips. It's still around, one of the earlier single chip solutions for Bluetooth Low Energy. And that was I believe TI even had an app note about doing that at the time. It was seen as a good way of making a lightweight responsive protocol. I would never do that nowadays. It's for two reasons. One, it gets back to that sort of adding complexity to an attribute rather than adding more attributes. You're now building another protocol, which requires the development of opcodes, you know, that then have to be handled by another layer within your application, rather than the layer that already exists to separate what you're trying to actually access, which is handled by the Bluetooth stack. Additionally, that gets back to the point about cybersecurity, where I'm pretty convinced. I don't have good evidence on this, to be honest. I haven't done a thorough you know, research on this, but I might at some point. But based on what I've seen, you know, firsthand, I have a sneaking suspicion that most vulnerabilities, most security vulnerabilities, are due to this application level design and people trying to build in functions like this, where they just implement a table, for example, and then you write to the characteristic the element from the table you want. But if you make that table implemented in a way that doesn't do bounds checking, because in your testing you never bothered to send it a number that was out of the scale, out of the bounds of the table you're reading from, then you've just given them access to you know, memory that was not intended to give them access to, which could be sensitive information that they shouldn't have access to. So I think it's, you know, it's a way of it sort of obfuscates and it gets rid of some of that useful expressiveness that I think Bluetooth Low Energy provides you.
Okay, we think we have time for one more.
Okay.
So last question, is the pairing vulnerability only during pairing versus every time someone who's already paired reconnects?
Neither these days, kind of. It used to be, and it still is with some older devices, the legacy pairing modes, the JustWorks legacy pairing mode, sent the keys over the unencrypted air. So anyone who saw the exchange, the initial exchange, could decrypt all of your traffic going forward, basically. That's an oversimplification, but not by much. It was very, very easy. And in fact, you know, there are sniffer tools. I probably should mention that. Everyone should get a sniffer tool if you have the budget for it. There are sniffer tools that actually bank on this. And if you use legacy JustWorks pairing, they will be able to decrypt all of your traffic as long as they see that initial packet. That's no longer true with what's called secure connections. LE secure connections, I think it's called, which came out with Bluetooth 5, I want to say 5.0. Now there's a public key, private key, elliptical Diffie-Hellman system, which is fairly standard these days, that makes it much more difficult to do that. So no, you're not really at the same risk. But the point is not about sniffing a connection that is already established, which is one type of attack, but about other types of attacks where, for example, so for example, the JustWorks pairing doesn't check that the other side of the link is who they say they are. There's no authentication of the other side link because it can't. It doesn't know. So if you get in there before someone else is paired, you can pair to the device. It has no idea who you are. As long as you ask it to pair, it'll do that. There are other ways of controlling that, but they basically boil down to those pairing methods. So the risk there with the pairing is not that someone sees that pairing event happen. The risk is that someone malicious comes in and does the pairing. Whether with JustWorks, they only have to be within range to do it. With passcode, they have to have the passcode, which means they have to be able to see whatever the passcode is. And that's the sort of proximity that I was talking about.
Okay, I think we probably could go on for another hour with questions. But,
I'd love to. That's the interesting part to me.
I know. But everyone, I see Lauren put her email information into the chat. She will definitely help you get connected with Nick. So I recommend you reach out to Lauren Noel at Sunrise Labs with more questions. I know that this was incredibly insightful for a lot of people just based on how many questions are coming in and how many questions I have. So Nick, thank you so much for doing this. And you know what? Thank you for keeping it cheerful, even when talking about cybersecurity. That's pretty difficult to do, and I'm impressed. And thank you to Sunrise Labs for putting this on for us. This is incredible. So everyone, have a wonderful rest of your evening and a happy inauguration day tomorrow. And I hope to see you all very, very soon. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal.
Thank you.
Good job, Nick.